Back on McGraw Live in the morning.
It makes you want to do a little jig, doesn't it?
It makes me want to, I don't know, listen to 40s music on the...
Do a little jig, do a little swing.
Our next guest has credentials that would take me about 300 years to get. First of all, she has made Forbes magazine's first ever 30 under 30 list for media. She works currently for the New York Times. She used to work at the Wall Street Journal, and she's already won more awards than I will ever win in my entire life. Please welcome to McGraw Live in the Morning, Mary Pilon.
Thanks so much for having me and that generous introduction.
I mean, I read that, and I'm like, if they had a 30 under 30 in the media when I was under 30, I would never have made it till I was 330. So
good for you, man. That just makes me feel like an underachiever, but that's fantastic.
All right, all of us have played the game or are familiar with the game Monopoly. And everybody sort of vaguely knows that it's based on properties in Atlantic City. But what people really don't know, and I find to be really the most interesting about all stories, is the backstory, is the historical story about how this game came about and sort of what this iconic, I guess, board game, where it came from. So Mary has written a book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the game Monopoly and sort of the makings of this thing?
Sure. So it turns out the backstory here ended up being really, really complicated and kind of crazy at times. I, like everybody, thought it was invented by a man during the Great Depression, Charles Darrow. There was a version of this story that was tucked into game boxes for years, that at the height of the Great Depression, he goes into his basement, he dreams up this game, puts Atlantic City properties on it to remind people of better times. The game goes on to become a massive bestseller. You know, he obviously is wealthy and everybody's happy because Monopoly is this great game. The problem is that's not exactly true. And actually the game originated with a woman in 1904. A woman named Lizzie McGee received a patent for something called the Landlord's Game, and she actually made it as a left-wing teaching tool. So there's a great irony there, right? And it was played extensively for over 30 years by a who's who of left-wing America, way before Parker Brothers entered the picture. And all this history was, buried for decades.
See, not even close to what everyone thought.
No,
it's like really digging back.
Yeah, what turns out to be sort of this like capitalistic sort of iconic tool started out as sort of like a socialist's manifesto to teach their children about how the evil landlords were taking on the poor people.
Right. So Lizzie McGee was an impassioned follower of this guy named Henry George, who most people today don't know who that is, but he was a very prominent political economist of his time. And sometimes his followers called themselves anti-monopolists. So the game has turned out to become a symbol of almost exactly the opposite of what it was invented to be.
Interesting that you mentioned that, because right around the turn of the century, people would think, oh, well, it was the Andrew Carnegies of the world and the Rockefellers of the world. And these were people that people looked up to. But the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, was actually a trust or a monopoly buster, and he was no socialist. So there was sort of a movement in the country that there was some unfairness, that there were too few people that had too much, and yet there were a lot of people that didn't hardly have anything. So how did Monopoly become a popular board game?
So that's a great question. The folk version of the game that was played from 1904 to the 30s, because when people played the game, they just made their own copies. So we don't really know. It's almost impossible to get sales figures. But it exploded in the 1930s. And there's a bunch of reasons maybe why that is. Parker Brothers was manufacturing it, so maybe it was easier to get during the Great Depression. And a lot of people didn't think Monopoly was going to be successful, because at a time when nobody had any money or real estate, why would you want to play a game that's what it was all about? But I would actually argue that board games, including Monopoly, they are fantasy. They are role-playing on some level. So it explodes. And it's a really unusual board game, too, because a hit in the toy and game industry is rare. One that's a perennial that is played generation after. And I mean, That's really, really unusual. And the fact that we're sitting here talking about it all this time later. And what's hilarious about reading some of Lizzie McGee's writings and some of the conversation around Henry George is that these are the exact same things people are arguing about today. How to distribute wealth, who's rich, who's poor, how much should the government intervene. I mean, I had so many moments researching
the book. And who's going to be the dog and who's going to be the thimble? These are the big problems.
Hard-hitting questions.
The top hat.
Mary Pilon is our guest. The book is The Monopolists: Obsession, Fury, and Scandal Behind the World's Famous and Favorite Board Game. Who who is Ralph Onspock? This guy seems like an interesting character. He's it's almost like a guy that you would see in some kind of a spy novel. Who is this guy, and how is he related to the Monopoly
So
issue?
all of the history that we've been talking about, that the game originated with Lizzie McGee and a woman and had this history for 30 years before Parker Brothers, that came about in the most accidental ways, and that came about because of Ralph Onspock. He was an economist living in Berkeley in the 1970s, and he makes a game called Anti-Monopoly. He's very concerned with the OPEC oil cartels, the Nixon administration.
What a god, professor at Berkeley was anti-monopoly. Sorry.
Right, exactly. So a lot more on the book on that. And it's not long before he hears from attorneys for Parker Brothers who say, you can't be making anti-monopoly. And this kicks off a 10-year-long legal battle in which Ralph digs up the true story, and a lot of his fate hinges on proving that the game didn't originate with Darrow and invented with this woman. And he starts, it's a totally insane story in and of itself, that he starts flying around the country trying to track down these people. This is in the 1970s, and he's trying to find people from the 1930s, so a lot of people have died. There's a lot of dead ends. Doing research before the era of Google, I would argue, was pretty challenging.
Jeez.
And,
Can you
it,
imagine
and,
that?
it predates the Falwell versus Hustler case on parody. So this guy's getting crushed. Here's a guy who's like sort of a left-wing kind of socialist kind of guy who's getting crushed by the very powers that he wants to take on, and yet he's making a political satire that just a few years later he probably would have been able to do had they not come after him. What ended up happening with this anti-monopoly game that Onspock was involved in producing?
Sure. So after a long slog in the courts, he wins, but Parker Brothers tries to appeal to the Supreme Court. I mean, this case goes all the way up, and the Supreme Court refuses to hear the appeal. So Ralph not only wins his right to make anti-monopoly, but they uphold a lot of the research that he found, and that Darrow didn't create this game. You can actually still buy Anti-Monopoly today.
Really?
Well, let's sell the monopolists' obsession, fury, and scandal behind the world's favorite board game. Mary Pilon, how do we get a hold of this new book of yours?
It's all over the place. It's on Amazon, IndieBound, Barnes & Noble, Powell's, all over.
That's so crazy. I'm going to go buy it. I want to go read it now. I'm like, really?
She wrote a book, New York Times, Wall Street Journal.
I know.
All right, Mary Pilon, thank you so much. And book signing in town? You're in town?
Yes, I was in town yesterday, and my website has all my upcoming dates. It's marypilon.com.
marypilon.com, Pilon.
Correct.
.com. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to watching you be successful in your career.
I knew her when.
There you go. Mary Pilon, everybody. We'll be right back.